Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 25, and I'm going to talk about Seal Deck because we have the Sealed Open coming up on the weekend. The first day is in Sealed, and Sealed is slightly different than Draft. So I want to look at some differences in the data. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the deep data, so I can't go really like super deep in the analysis of the casting costs differences and color differences, but I took whatever I could scrape, and hopefully that will be informative to you. Um, on the other side, the second day of the Open will be in best of three, and best of three again is very different from the best of one. So I'm going to look at some cards that are performing differently in those two formats, and then I'm going to check uh, how does the Artifact-Enchantment spectrum look like in the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. As you know, there are colors that are more focusing on the artifacts and more focusing on the enchantments. I'm going to try to look um, at what the differences are, and in terms of win rates and in terms of predominance of density of artifacts and enchantments in different decks. And I will have a small section that I will look at a couple of cards that I thought were interesting, um, because they were predicted to be good and are not good, or because they were predicted to be medium and are pretty decent, and then what goes on in there. So we're going to look at those things. But as always, before I will do my preamble to warm myself up in talking. And today it's not going to be a fun one. Normally I try to make them light, talk about some data, but I woke up today and I found out that Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's been a downer. You know, I have lots of friends in Ukraine. Actually, house I was living in Poland was built by the Ukrainians. Um, we always had contacts with them. We are very, very close as neighbors. Poland and Ukraine occupied the same country for centuries, really. And well, Ukraine drew the shorter straw because it was more to the east and was a part of Soviet Union, even though most people in there definitely didn't want to be that part of it. Then, when the Iron Curtain collapsed, Ukraine became an independent country with, a big luggage from being a Soviet republic for so long. But there's definitely a willingness of Ukrainians to be closer with the Western countries than to be back as a satellite client state of Russia. And that was always a thorn in Russia's side. So I picked this beautiful plains that sort of reminds me of the Ukrainian flag, with the blue sky above and the steppe driven beautiful wheat fields at the bottom, the blue and yellow. I, I It's awful what's happening in there, because I do know that Ukrainians always aspire to be a part of free countries, and they were always neglected because they were always considered to be in the Russian influence zone. And right now we're paying for being lenient towards Russia as a state. Again, I don't have anything against Russians as people, because I also know a lot of them, and loads of them are very nice people. But as a country, Russia has been a menace, has been a problem, and has been a problem that's been ignored by the West for Jesus Christ, for so long. This country is doing the opposite of what a country should do. Normal countries, what they do, or at least try to do, is take care of their own people and focus on that, make the best possible place for their own population to live in. Russia is quite the opposite. Russia just wants to make everyone miserable so that they don't have to focus on the internal problems. And they have been doing that for last 20 years easily. And last 20 years have seen the development of the technology that Russia is very, very, very good at using in internet. And they've been menacing it for ages. All the fake news, anti-science propaganda can be readily tracked to Russian influence, because if you can't build, you can destroy. Destruction takes much less energy than building, because building requires planning, strategy, thought, care. Neither of those things are characteristic of the Russian state in the last 20 years. And, you know, I'm going to start you on a downer, but it doesn't look very well. If the West is just going to let Russia roll over Ukraine, who is going to be next? Poland, my country, is bordering Ukraine. Are we next? Does defense of Russian influence zone require removal all the states that are in NATO that are bordering it? It just doesn't make any sense. And if the West is not going to make serious steps, and I'm not meaning serious steps, we're going to write a very angry letter. I mean steps like proper action, support, and making sure that Ukraine can stand tall and not be invaded. We're in for a very, very tough period. And I do know that it's not easy to negotiate with a nuclear power, but keep in mind that 20 years ago, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. Ukraine voluntarily resigned from having nuclear weapons because they got guarantees of its sovereignty and its independence from both Russia and the United States. Russia just now takes back on it. And what kind of message does it send? We resigned from having nuclear weapons because we were guaranteed peace despite having them. Now it just shows that those guarantees were worth nothing. What other country will think now, maybe we should skip having nuclear arsenal because the world is a more or less peaceful place right now? None. And I wouldn't blame them. If I was a country, I would definitely try to develop nuclear weapons as quickly as possible to get some kind of protection. So yeah, there we go. Shitty situation and an awful blow to whatever freedom stands for. Anyway, on the lighter side of things, we're going to talk about sealed deck today. And, the situation in Ukraine is terrible. And it's terrible for people that live there, but we still have our little things that are insignificant in the scale of the world that we can talk about it. And if you think that I started with such a downer and I continue like nothing else happened with seal deck analysis, we have climate change. It's been there forever, and I could start every single preamble that I do about climate change. I don't do it. I still talk about the silly magic card game for children, and I'm going to continue talking about it because in the end, the one thing that can keep us sane is go on with our lives like it. Well, like nothing happens because we can, and this is something that the Ukrainians don't have the liberty to do anymore, but we can and we should. But we should also not forget that the situation is pretty grave. Anyway, seal deck. So seal deck is different from draft because in seal deck you open packs, and whatever you open in those packs, that has to make your deck. And that's very different from opening multiple packs, getting cards passed, because you cannot carve your lane in sealed deck. You just have to design the lane that you've been given. And sealed is, I think, underestimated and very often brushed aside as the luck dependent format, which I think it's very much not. Really good limited players can build a very good deck out of a pool that other peoples will just ignore and think that they were very, very, very unlucky. So if you are a good limited player and very open to experimenting, putting synergies that normally don't come together in your deck, then you will go quite far in that. Furthermore, sealed deck is very, very friendly towards creative sideboarding, because you start with your deck, and very often if you think that your deck just doesn't have the tools to beat what opponent has to offer you, you can completely transform your deck. You can even change all the colors. I've had not more than one sealed deck when I just sideboarded the whole deck after the first game and changed my emphasis, because I saw, okay, I'm not going to outvalue this value-driven deck because they have more value, they open better value. At least maybe I can go under them. And yes, it won't work every single time, but it will work a couple of times, so it's worth thinking. The emphasis in sealed deck most of the time is on power. We didn't have sets which allowed super aggressive decks to come together very easily in sealed, because you just don't get the right cards. In a draft, you can focus on picking 2 drops, picking 1 drops, and sealed, whatever you open, that's yours. So most of the time, it will sort of move itself towards this kind of mid-range piles. However, aggro is still possible. Second thing that sealed decks have that draft decks, well, at least you try to aim not to have, is that they are usually low on synergy, because you're just not lucky enough to open exactly the perfect cards in your pool that will let you to draw maximum from the synergies hidden in the set. There is some pockets of synergy, and there's some amount of mechanisms, because that's how sets are designed, but it will be generally lower on synergy, and we will see that in statistics of some cards that are super heavily synergy driven. Second of all, sealed deck, at least in theory, will tend towards 2 to 3 color decks rather than your usual 2 color decks, because you just won't open enough cards to in some cases to have a consistent 2 color deck. So you might be more open to splashing, more open to putting 3 colors if you have bombs in them, especially. And because of the mid-range characteristic of the sealed deck, at least the common knowledge and all of those things that I'm talking about now are based on the theoretical common knowledge. We're going to look at some data to see if those common knowledge things actually are seen in the data. But the common conception is that draw is much more strong. Discard cards are actually stronger. Unconditional removal is at a premium because you open 6 rares, so you have a bigger chance of getting bombs that will require hard removal, because conditional removal usually doesn't deal very well with large creatures, for example. So those things should be at a premium. Okay. So first thing I wanted to look at is differences in how the sealed decks are built compared to the draft decks. Let me put my trusty laser pointer. So the red bars are the draft decks and the blue bars are the sealed decks. And the first thing that we can see is that 2 color decks are actually more predominant in draft, because you plan to draft a 2 color deck. We know that splashing comes at a price, so not everything that you should splash. Not everything that you draft should be splashed, because it just doesn't give you enough value as opposed to the consistency that it removes from your deck. However, in sealed, we see there is roughly 9 percentage points difference less of the 2 color decks. So as if in draft, 2/3 of the decks are strict 2 colors, and sealed it's only 57% that are strict 2 colors. And most of that difference is locked in splashing in 2 color decks, which happens 5 percentage points more frequently in sealed. So we have 23% of the draft decks are splashing, and 28% of the sealed decks are splashing. And there is plenty of 3 color. And this is based on the 17lands.com statistics, which say that splash is like up to 3 cards of an additional color, with some basic lands of that color also present. So 2 color and splash, so this low amount of the third color is 28%, but there's 12% of sealed decks that are strictly 3 colors, so there is more than 3 cards of each color in the deck. And this number is only 5% in draft. So there is a big difference. There's more than twice the amount of 3 color decks in sealed as opposed to draft. So when you build a sealed, you should be open to the idea that you might have to do a 3 color deck. And then there is not much happening in the 3 color and splash 4 color and all kinds of match shenanigans. They are usually absent. Like good 95% of the decks are in the range of 2 color and splash, and 3 color. However, what we can see is that draft has way more of the monocolor decks, or monocolor decks with the slight splash. So there's 3.5% of the decks in draft, so roughly 1 in 30 will be a monocolor, or a monocolor with a slight splash, while in sealed it's only 0.5%, so sevenfold difference between those. And also worth noting that monocolor decks in draft are quite high. They have a quite high win rate. They actually have the highest win rate of all the categories of the color combinations. while in sealed, monocolor decks are usually performing poor, and in the stats they are like below 50% win rate. So it's a fun dream to build a monocolored sealed in this, but in this format, I wouldn't recommend chasing it. Better focus on good two-color decks rather than trying to force being a monocolor. Furthermore, we can look at the color per frequency and the draft versus sealed. And there are some differences. So the most played color in draft is Dimir with around 16%. Of the two-color decks, this stats only show the two-color decks without splash. So around 16% of the two-color decks are Dimir. And actually in sealed, it's close to being set first, but not quite first, at 14.5%. So roughly 1.5% percentage point difference between Dimir in draft and sealed. And this basically mirror flips with Selesnya, which is the second most popular deck in draft, but the first popular deck in sealed. So these differences are relatively small, and given the numbers of the decks in sealed, which are lower than in draft, I wouldn't draw too much attention to that. But there is a couple of colors that are significantly less popular in sealed, and as we might look later, there might be good reasons for that. And Izzet is one of them. It's drafted 8.5% of the time, but it's constructed in sealed only at 4.2% of the time. So there is almost a twofold difference between draft and sealed. And small spoiler for the next slides, Izzet is doing particularly badly in sealed in terms of win rates. So maybe there is a good reason not to build Izzet pools when you do that. Weirdly, Boros is quite popular in sealed at 13.5%, opposed to 9% in draft. But it also has not a very unimpressive win rate. So probably people build Boros when they don't have an idea how to build another deck, and very likely in loads of cases, you probably build this Boros deck because you think, okay, I don't have good cards to build a mid-range, I'll try to build some kind of an aggro deck. It doesn't look like it's a good strategy in this format. Maybe it's better to try to build a 3-color deck with best cards in your pool and close your eyes and hope for the best. Other cards, Rakdos is much lower in sealed than in draft, and I think Rakdos is the most synergistic color pair in Kamigawa. So there is a good reason for having it a bit less in sealed, and you will see in some card statistics why that might be so. On the other hand, Orzhov is doing better, is built more in sealed than it is in draft by also like roughly 3 percentage points. So 8.4% in draft, 11.2% in sealed. And I think here it's also something to think about when you open your pool. Orzhov is doing particularly well in sealed. So there is something about that color combination that promotes being in sealed. And I think that it is partially because of the mid-range characteristics of the cards in Orzhov archetype. And the rest of the pairs are roughly even, so nothing special to see them. Especially the ones that are drafted little are also played little in sealed. So Azorius, Gruul, and Simic, in particular, they are around between 8 and 6% of the drafts and seals. Right. So how does it look at when we look at the color pairs? So first of all, the trickiness of comparing sealed and draft is that people win in draft much more. The 17 lands users win much more in draft than in sealed. So on average, when you look at it, it's about 2 percentage points difference. And you should maybe adjust those bars in your head. So if the difference is around 2%, it means that the color pair is roughly the same in draft and sealed. If the cards are even, that means that actually this color combination is better in sealed. And you can see that in Orzhov. I already told you that this is something that we might want to look at closer. The win rate in draft in Orzhov is 56.5%. In sealed, it's 56.4%, which means that this color is way better in sealed than it is in draft by probably roughly 2 percentage points because of the difference in the general win rate. Um, and this is the color that is the closest to each other between draft and sealed. So probably it gains the most between the two different formats. And if we go back to the previous slide, you can see that people do somehow notice it or do instinctively feel it. And we see that the seals in Orzhov are built more than they are in draft. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have Izzet, which has a 54.5% win rate in draft and only 50% in sealed. And this is way below the average win rate for sealed. So this color combination performs particularly badly. So possibly there is just not enough density of things that Izzet wants to be doing. This is comparing best of one draft to best of one sealed. Yes, Jason. I decided to do that comparison because most people will play best of one sealed on day one, I assume. When it comes to other colors, maybe a couple of interesting ones of the lower win rates. Gruul and Boros, they win roughly the same in draft and sealed, which means that they do slightly better in sealed. Not big differences, around 1% between their performance in draft and sealed, which means that it should flip to 1% advantage in sealed. Dimir does slightly worse, and I think that this is, again, you will not always get the right density of the Dimir stuff to play it well, and there is also the difference between draft and sealed performance in Simic of around 3 percentage points, which means that you should be wary of assembling a pile of Dimir and Simic. Probably it's because those, especially Dimir, it might have a good tempo game, but for tempo game you need to probably draft a deck when you get a more bespoke cards for the purpose for the plan that you're trying to assemble, and you will not always get it in sealed. And also, blue-black cards are usually not so great at being mid-range. So maybe this color combination just suffers from being just outplayed by other versions of mid-range. Ottawa asks, how can every deck be lower win rate than draft? It's just that draft players have a higher win rate on 17 lands. I will look at it in just a very second. Probably next slide if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, now next slide is still trying to link the color per frequency versus win rate. So I tried to see if people sort of recognize it intuitively or by analysis. I don't know exactly what goes through their heads, and if people draft more the decks that win more. So on the one axis we have the win rate, and on the other axis we have a color per frequency, and you can see that there is not a very strong, but still a correlation between frequency of drafting particular decks and the win rates. I think that the correlation is slightly stronger in draft than in sealed, but still people try to assemble strong color pairs more frequently, which is not completely surprising because we know that 17 lands users are more invested players that know more about the format, in theory at least. So they should be able to identify what is doing better, especially after a couple of weeks of the format already taking place. But we see those correlations. So we see that the lowest win rate deck is the least drafted, for example, least assembled in sealed. We see that the decks that perform relatively poorly in draft are also the ones that are drafted at lower frequency, and we see that the decks that perform best are drafted slightly higher. And to lesser extent, we can see the same situation in sealed. But for example, here we can see a color combination which is assembled frequently but doesn't have a very high win rate, and we can check. This will be around 13% frequency, so that must be Boros. Yes, so Boros, for example, is assembled more frequently than it probably should be. So if something is assembled more frequently than it should be, then probably we can consider it being a sort of a trap. Right. So I looked at every single card in the format, and I compared the win rate of this card in sealed and in draft. So if it's above 0, it's better in sealed. If it's below 0, it's better in draft. And if you plot all of them on this axis, you see that very few cards are better in sealed and quite a lot of them are better in draft. Well, what does it tell me is people have a higher win rate in draft. So in order to get a more realistic approach, the thing that I didn't do with the win rates, just to draw your attention to that problem, is I can normalize it. And when I look at this data set, I can see that it actually is quite normally distributed, which is fine. So I could basically do a very, very, very simple normalization when I will just add a couple of percentage points to every value that I have here. And all of a sudden, our graph becomes more symmetrical with roughly 0 in the middle, and there are cards that are better in sealed and cards that are better in draft. Now, obviously, lots of it is going to be variance, especially because the sealed deck sample sizes are not super impressively large. And we're still learning the format. It's just been 2 weeks. I know that lots of things are discovered in 2 weeks, but it takes time for people to absorb them. We should see a more stable metagame from the week 3 onwards. But for now, we're still like in the late discovery phase. So keep in mind those caveats that this is a normalized data, first of all, and it's not a perfect normalization. Second of all, we don't know exactly if people know what they are doing yet. And third of all, some numbers, they might be just because of natural variance and not because of the. Jason is asking that if why the format hasn't been already solved. And obviously Jason is making fun of it because he solved the format on day -4 when he realized that Imperial Oath is the best card that you should draft, and he's continuing doing it, and I'm pretty sure nailing it. Otto was asking where's the sealed data from. Sealed data is from 17lands.com because every data is from 17lands.com. But I only use the data in its most basic form because I didn't have access to the full data that I normally use because 17lands is applying some serious changes. So for the next couple of days, all hands on deck, and they're trying to figure out how to improve some metrics because of some data issues that we've been discussing in the previous seminar. Okay, so after normalizing this, we get probably a bunch of cards here that are really good in, better in sealed, and a bunch of cards that are better in draft. So let's look at maybe some names just to see what's going to happen. And so first of all, one of the overperformance in sealed in terms of cards is Gift of Wrath. That's the 4-mana enchant aura that gives +2/+2 and menace to a creature, and when it leaves battlefield, it creates a 2/2 menace token. And this card has a 6.6% higher percentage point higher win rate in sealed than in draft, mainly because it does pretty poorly in draft, but also it does really decently in sealed. And I think that the difference between sealed and draft in case of this card makes me quite confident to say that probably this card is actually decent in sealed. Otto was asking if a skilled limited player on average will have a more of an edge in draft than in sealed. I think it's an it depends kind of question. I think that it very much depends on how much you focus on playing sealed. People that played GPs a lot and then had to think about their pools immense amount of times, like Max Mick or Harry Mildenstein. I think he's pretty good in that. Or Paul Ritzel. They were like masters of seal deck, and they could build very creative pools. And I would highly recommend looking at what they're doing with their sealed. An average drafter might actually have a problem with sealed because you get decks that you're just not used to play if you're a good drafter, because the idea in sealed is sort of salvaging the train wreck rather than having a perfect deck, and people that are really good in drafting the hard way might have a slight disadvantage there, because they're just so not used to having to salvage the wreck because they never wreck the draft. So that's a problem. Oh, like that Jordan says he's awful at sealed, and I can imagine why, because that Jordan never train wrecked a draft in his life. So why would he know? Hi, Mud Moses. So yeah, but coming back to the thing, Gift of Wrath is performing particularly better, and it's head and shoulders for those that are listening to this in the form of podcast. It's 6.6 percentage point difference, while the second biggest difference card is Lucky Offering with 4.4. So that's a massive difference. Again, makes me think that Gift of Wrath is very, very useful. Now, other two cards that we see improved is Lucky Offering, the 1 mana artifact destruction card, and Reckoner's Bargain. That's the 2 mana sacrifice a card, gain life. Sacrifice a creature, gain life equal to its toughness, and draw 2 cards. So the sort of deadly dispute of the format. Lucky Offering, I can imagine that because people try to squeeze in a 2-color deck, they will very often play colorless cards as filler just to make sure that they can play those 2 colors. So it will have many more targets than in draft, because in draft, if you're white green, there is probably not very many good reasons to play artifacts at all. And there is a bunch of decks that don't contain any artifacts. We're going to talk about it a bit later. So I think, and I don't have the data to confirm it, but my intuition tells me that there will be more artifacts on. There will be fewer decks with very few artifacts in sealed format, which makes Lucky Offering slightly better, because if you can kill something for 1 mana, gain 3 life, that's a good deal in this kind of grindy mid range. Ultra Risk Hero is asking, is interested, or they are interested on how Kumano Faces Kakazan is in sealed, given that it's a super aggro card. I'm not going to talk about it in the seminar, but off the top of my head, I was impressed by the numbers of it. So it has better numbers than in draft, if I remember correctly, or there and about, which means that there are possible decks that go super aggro and go under this mid-range kind of sealed versions. And Kumano Faces Kakazan is a key part of those. So it does well, but it probably has fewer homes than you would normally expect. Okay, other cards that we see that are better. Well, we have a couple of bombs. We have the AO, the Dawn Sky. We have Thundering Reiju. Oh, well, there's the Kumano Face Kakazan. Actually, it's doing better by 2.9 percentage points in sealed. But as I said, it has smaller numbers. But okay, let's go back. We have AO, we have Thundering Raiju, we have Farewell, the Wandering Emperor, Atsushi, Tatsunari. So we have a couple of bombs that do better, and that's probably because they're just like maybe drafted around in drafts and not necessarily in the colors that are particularly open. Well, here you can just build a deck and nothing is really open, so they should have a slight boost out of that. There's a couple of performers in draft that are also doing well. And I think that Dragon Spark Reactor and Thundersteel Colossus are particularly underperforming in best of one. And okay, maybe I'm using the word underperforming a bit willy-nilly, but they show numbers that are very disappointing. And maybe those disappointing numbers are because people don't build the decks right. We were going to test it, at least in case of one of those cards, pretty soon. But they do better both in sealed and, if I remember correctly, also in the best of three. So maybe there is something that you can utilize those cards slightly better than people do in best of one, or maybe they just are not particularly good in the best of one format because they don't get those busted openings when the opponent struggles a bit with the mana or something. That will happen more frequently in best of three, for example, or will not have perfect curve outs because sealed just doesn't allow you to have perfect curve outs. And here a couple of interesting things. Upraiser Renegade has 3 percentage point bonus. This is the 1/3 that gets +2/+0 for each modified creature you control. And this might have something to do with tendency of seals to get a board stall. And in a board stall, if you have a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, 5-drop, and the opponent has 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, 5-drop, if your 2-drop is like a 5/3, that puts you slightly advantage. So maybe that's the reason why this card is doing well. There's the Blade Blizzard Kitsune, and I think that this is one of those cards that will be part of this super aggro strategy. Because a 3-mana 2/2 double striker will finish the game very quickly if you have a couple of tricks. And that might be one of the strategies of going under the aggressive starts. Same with the Kumano faces Kakazan. I mean, I can imagine playing Kumano on turn 2 and playing the Blade Blizzard Kitsune on turn 3. And if the opponent was not lucky with opening removal in their pool, you might just steal the game with that kind of combination. I think that so Zach is saying that really surprising that aggro cards are overperformance. I think that in every sealed format there is pools that really you should try the super aggro builds, because I played a sealed a couple of days ago and I opened like this cornucopia of mid-range stuff. I had like Boseju, Saga. I had two of the longest night or whatever, the 4-mana black one when you have to sacrifice creatures or discard cards. Like bunch of this mid-range stuff. But I was very fragile to explosive openings, and in the end, I did lose one mirror. Long Reach of Night, thank you. I did lose one game to a mirror that was just bigger mid range, and I couldn't do much about it. But 2 games I lost to super aggressive openings where I just couldn't stabilize in time. And I stabilized like on 2 life, and they just played Okiba Reckoner raid, and that was game for me. So in the end, it went 6-3, but it was just not enough because those super aggressive openings were too much for me to handle. One card that is interesting is Shrine Steward, and that is mainly because we also see a couple of Goshintais also overperforming. So maybe there is if you open multiple shrines, maybe it's worth building around. So we have Shrine Steward at around 2.9 percentage point advantage. Goshintai of Ancient Wars, which I think is the red one, at 2.6, and Goshintai of Boundless Vigor, which I want to say green, is at 2.2%. And there were a couple of them just below 2 percentage points, which was my cutoff. So it seems like Goshintai build around is a thing that exists. What else do we have? Some lands, that doesn't matter. Eater of Virtue is another bomb. That's the 1-mana Bone Splinter kind of equipment. Grafted Hollow, Grafted Growth, that's the enchantment that gives you mana of any color and puts a +1/+1 counter on something. That is probably interesting to That's something that probably helps you play multicolor decks. So Busily is asking if Dragon Spark Reactor has 3.5 percentage point improvement, does it mean it has a 54% game in hand win rate? Would it still be worth avoiding it? We are going to have slides dedicated to Dragon Spark Reactor, so I'm going to talk about it in a second. Frosty Feet says, looks like there's lots of Boros cards here. Possible that is just due to Boros performing better in sealed than in draft. Um, so yes and no. If we go back to the win rates, I mean Boros performs slightly less worse than in draft, but that's expected because draft win rates are just higher. So you should mentally adjust it to 55.1 if you want to compare them 1 to 1. Um, and it's still not that easy because the pairing system is different in sealed than in draft and blah 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 whatever. But yeah, partially that's because of that. But Orzhov is even more pronounced, and you don't see that big of an improvement of that. So uh, you don't see many Orzhov cards. Um, yeah, I mean that's basically it. The rest of the cards, these all, you can put some weight on them or not. They might be because of the small sample sizes. So keep that always in mind. That I don't want to make sweeping conclusions out of that. One interesting card that I skipped is Azusa's Managed Journeys, which has a solid 2.7 percentage points difference. And that might be because if you're playing the mid-range game, if you manage to ramp yourself into something useful while not stopping playing creatures, you will gain quite an advantage. So I think that Azusa's Managed Journeys might be better in those slower grindier formats. Now, if we look at the underperformers, and lots of those cards I wouldn't put too much weight on. I have fruit flies. But the card that has the biggest decrease in performance is Onicult Anvil. And this is something I told you about the low amount of synergy. Onicult Anvil can be an excellent card in draft when you have a bunch of artifacts and an aggressive deck, and you just use this uh, to finish off the game. But in sealed, you will be very unlikely to open the right density of artifacts, and probably that's why you see the decrease of performance in this card. Um, Sisyphus asks, do you have a Google Doc or something where interested viewers can download these slides? So I'm thinking about it. I still didn't do it because I'm lazy by nature. I do keep all the presentations and I do keep the slides in the PDF format where I could possibly upload them, but I still didn't figure the best way. And I'm thinking about doing it, but maybe as a Patreon or something. So I'll let you know when it happens, and it might happen. But for the time being, I just upload the video back to YouTube so we can rewatch it, and you can get the presentation for that. But if you want to download it, yeah, if I have to keep them on some kind of repository, I probably will do it via Patreon if I start it. But okay, Onicult Anvil has a decreased win rate. I don't know what Historian's Wisdom is doing because I still didn't figure out how to play this card. It has shockingly good numbers in best of one for me because I thought it would be very, very bad. So I'm not going to discuss why it's bad. Scrap Welder is probably having the same problem as Onicult Anvil. It's not a great card. It is the 3/3 that you can sacrifice an artifact to bring back an artifact with a lower mana value from the graveyard. It's probably, again, not as good in the decks that have a lower density of artifacts. We have a couple of tricks like planar incisions in favor of Jukai that have also lower win rates. I'm not going to focus on those. Interesting part: invoke the ancients, invoke despair, invoke the winds, invoke justice. We have 4 invoke spells in those underperformance list, and this is something that is predictable because you will not get the density of one color that is good enough to play those casting cost heavy spells. All the invoke spells need 4 of mana of one particular color in their mana cost. So you will realistically not be able to play them very frequently unless you have a particular deck that will help you to to somehow negate the problem related to the cost by playing almost only one color, which I already showed you doesn't happen very frequently in sealed. So that's probably why you see the drop in the invoke spells win rate. Um, by the way, I mean, and this cannot be completely an accident. This is the sort of a planar incision is a combat trick, favor of Jukai is a combat trick, Regent's authority is a combat trick, return to action is a combat trick. We see those cards in the top 10 of underperformance performers, and it couldn't be completely um, an accident. Then we have Jin-Jitaxias, Progress Tyrant. I think that well, I'm not a big fan of the card, but this is a purely personal bias. I played my first draft with it and it sucked. And I'm off it. I weaned off it, but it's also underperforming in sealed, which is actually quite surprising because when you think about it, I would be thinking that a 7 mana creature will do better in this slower format, which sealed is to be. Zach says, if your main color, if the invoke spell is in your main color, they might still be good enough if you're casting them on turn 7-8. Yeah. Question is, what are the odds of casting them on turn 7-8, even if you play a 9-8 mana base? I think that, you would realistically want to play something like 11 6 mana bases to play them, or have a lot of green fixing in case of the green invoke spell. So with 9-8, you're still not really guaranteed to play them on turn 7-8. You probably are thinking more like turn 9-10, and that might be just slightly too late. And I'm pretty sure that a bunch of that low win rate is because people still try to play them nonetheless in the decks that shouldn't play them. People build bad mana bases all the time, and I think that this is something that we should pay more attention to before we submit our deck and start playing. You should really spend maybe not as much time on thinking about the mana base, but not far off. You should think about the mana base quite a lot. Another card that we have is Mecca Titan Core, and again, I think that this is the artifact synergy problem that that we have. And we have a couple of cards that are definitely there because of the super high win rate in best of one, like Blossom Prancer and Kapatek Wrecker. These cards have still very, very good numbers in sealed, and you should always play them. They're just like slightly lower numbers in sealed. Still impressive though. And we have couple of the blue-black rares which might be related to a blue-black performing worse, or it might be due to people trying to splash them and not getting there on the fixing. In Koto's The Silent Spider and Satoru Umezawa, they have significantly lower win rates. But I think these are more or less the cards that are underperforming in draft. I would especially focus on combat tricks that seem to be doing slightly worse, invoke spells that seem to be doing pretty badly, and high synergy things like Onicult Anvil, especially the artifact synergy cards like Onicult Anvil, because they might be a multifaceted trap. So not only Onicult Anvil might be a worse card because you just don't get the density of artifacts, but even worse, you might try to increase the density of artifacts by putting substandard artifacts in your deck, and you're going to lose not because only Occult Anvil is bad or in your deck, but because your deck is worse because you put only Occult Anvil and you try to support it in your deck. So this can be at least a trap in several levels. And without doing much, I did the same thing for best of 3. Comparing best of 1 draft and best of 3 draft, because the day 2 is going to be in best of 3. The overperformers are Lucky Offering with 6.6 percentage point improvement. But this is most likely because this card has been sideboarded in. So in best of 3 data, we will have both the first deck data and the sideboarding data. And I think Lucky Offering is just having a much higher win rate because people sideboard it in when it actually is good against the opponent. So that's a lesson that, sideboard cards are good when they are good as a sideboard card. Basically, tautological explanation. And I think that we have the same with the malicious malfunction, the -2/-2 to everything. People put it against a deck that has a lot of X2s. Same with explosive entry that has a 4 percentage point better performance in best of 3 draft. This is the one that destroys an artifact and gets a +1/+1 counter, if I'm not mistaken. So those cards do better. I already told you that Thundersteel Colossus had better results in sealed, and it's also better in best of 3. I don't know what the reason for that is. Then look. So some things I can't explain. AO the Dawn Sky. I don't know why it has a better numbers in both sealed and in best of 3. I assume it must be because in best of 1 people force it and don't get there every single time, and it's again the case of first picking AO, trying to draft white and being in the lane where white was not open, and still forcing it. So that might be the reason. And the rest of the cards are just at the level where I'm not particularly keen on speculating on them, because this is within the realm of natural variance of win rates. So it might be just a pure artifact. I think interesting, Guardians of Oboro, that's the 3/4 wall. And I think that this is again a case of sideboarding creatively. You can get this card late in best of 3, and it's going to be very, very good against some decks that base their performance on the 2/2s and 3/3s, and the 3/4 blocks them quite well. Yeah, exactly. Isaiah, it's a great sideboard card. But apart from that, the rest of the cards, Kami of Restless Shadows might be also sideboarded in, even if you don't have enough support for artifact and enchantment themes, as a 3/4 and a very good blocker. So maybe that's the reason for that card's increased performance. As for underperformance performers, Restoration of Aeganjo. This is the saga that makes you get a plains. You can discard something to get something from your graveyard, and in the end of it, you get a 3/4 vigilance that whenever it attacks or blocks, create a 1/1. I think that this is a drop because it's doing so well in best of 1, because the curve outs in best of 1 are just so much better than in best of 3. So that might be a slight punishment for that. Card is still very good. Invoke Despair, probably the same. It's just best of 3 mana draws are not as consistent as in best of 1, so you might lose a bit of value there. And Invoke Despair does not have as much fixing as the green one, for example. And yeah, we have some cards that just drop because they were so busted in best of 1. Touch the Spirit Realm, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Ogrehead Helm. All those cards just like have a very high win rate in best of 1, so maybe that's just a reversion to the mean. I don't see any particular card that would really like be there, that there would be a good reason for them not being as good as in best of 1, except for maybe smaller sample size um, and variance. So there is no good reason why Jugan Defends the Temple or Kura the Boundless Sky will become worse at best of 3. But Jugan Defends the Temple, for example, has an insane win rate in best of 1, so probably that's just a slight reversion to the mean. One interesting card is Patchwork Automaton. So in best of 3, maybe those all-in artifact decks are possibly slightly worse, mainly because people can sideboard their 3/4 walls against them in game 2 and 3, because they know what they're facing. So they are much easier to adapt against than mid-range decks, because if you can't beat the mid-range deck, you probably can't beat the mid-range deck. If you can't beat the aggro deck in game 1, you can probably transform your deck quite efficiently in games 2 and 3. Hey Mercurio, thank you for the sub. The seminar is going phenomenally. We started on a downer, but we're recovering. Okay. And I think that, it's going to be fun to play open. I don't know if I can make it because my mom is visiting, so we might do some sightseeing instead of playing the open. And then I don't want to play if I can't play day two. But it's definitely a good idea to have opens, and it's good idea to put more emphasis on sealed and best of three, especially for idiots like me that only play best of one. Um, and I think that you just should play more sealed, and you should at least approach sealed not as, oh, I opened a bad pool, therefore I'm probably going to lose, but you should use it as the ultimate brain teaser how to build a pool. And I would really strongly suggest that if you have a pool that you consider weaker before the open, go on those discords. Go to Courts Discord, go to Draft Lab Discord. They are all free, and ask how to build them, and ask for as many opinions as you can. As someone who played um, GPs with several buys, I spent 3 hours before I played game one, talking, walking from person to person, asking how would they build my pool, what would be their suggestions, and very often that created a whole strategy for my sideboarding that gave me a big advantage over the people that had to play from the first minute and didn't have time to think about their pool in such detail as I did. In the open, you get your pool. It's worth spending 1 hour to build it properly, test it against some people, and come up with the best solutions. Than playing straight away and then losing quickly and then having to queue another time. The investment of time in building the pool carefully and thinking about sideboard options, especially, is totally worth it. Right, that closes the open section of the seminar. And I have a couple of things about general draft, and that's based on best of one data because I had a more detailed data on best of one. So first of all, this set has one line of spectrum between colors is lying on artifact synergies versus enchantment synergies. And we have blue and red are more artifact focused, green and white are more enchantment focused, and black is the sort of in the middle kind of color. So first of all, I wanted to see how the decks perform on those lines. And to do so, I first looked at number of games by the number of artifacts and enchantments in deck. And you can see from those graphs, and if you're listening in the podcast, no, you can't see, but I'll try to explain it as best I can. But you can see that they have those very skewed curves where there is a bunch of decks that have 0 artifacts or enchantments, then it increases from there, reaches a peak at a number that I'm going to tell you later, and it starts to decrease. Now, the decks without enchantments are rarer, and that's mainly, I think, because of the sagas. And I think that the average number of enchantment per deck is higher than the average number of artifacts per deck. So the most common number of enchantments in a deck is 7. The most common number of artifacts in the deck is 5. However, as they start dropping off, the drop-off curve for artifact decks is a bit less steep. So the enchantments start dropping off, and actually at number 16, there is more artifacts decks that have 16 artifacts than enchantment decks that have 16 enchantments. So I think that there's a place for those ultra aggressive artifact decks. And there is no need for having so many enchantments. So there is no benefit for having 16 enchantments in your deck. You're quite content with the number between 8 and 12, and you're quite happy with it. How does this relate to win rates? Because these curves are lovely, and you can follow them. There's quite a logical progression of the increase and decrease of the decks that have particular number of enchantment and artifacts. By the way, if you didn't follow, this is the number of the games. This is the number of artifacts or enchantments per deck. This graph shows you the win rates. And here we have the number of blue artifacts or red enchantments per deck, and the win rate of the deck that have this particular number of enchantments and artifacts. And we can see that those curves sort of cross. So decks with few artifacts have high win rates, and the more artifacts you put in, the sort of lower win rate you get, until you reach that 16 magic 16 number, when you start seeing again the increase. So it seems to me that artifact synergies in this format are sort of like all or nothing. You don't want to be somewhere in the middle. You see a very different story when you look at the enchantments, where decks without enchantments are doing very poorly, mainly because sagas are busted, and you don't want to have a deck without any sagas, so you want to have some of them. And the more enchantments you get, the higher the win rate, and it goes sort of like almost to the end of that curve. With at the end, you get a couple of outliers, but that might be also to a smaller sample size. But basically, the rule you should maybe think about is that the more enchantments in your deck, the better. And it also has something to do with the colors that have the enchantments that are slightly better, like green. But you can perfectly find play 0 artifacts and you'll be fine. No, Mad Moses, this is more related to the best of one draft. I mean, so not open more enchantments, but get past more enchantments. Okay. So this is the artifact enchantment spectrum. Now, as the last segment of today's seminar, I wanted to talk a bit about a couple of cards that people were asking in other streamers' chats that I fished out, or I was thinking about them, or both, in this case, both. Where I thought it would be nice maybe to dive very briefly into that card and try to speculate what's going on in there. So the card I'm going to talk about is Dragonspark Reactor. That's a 1 red artifact. Whenever it or another artifact enters the battlefield, put a charge counter on it, and for 4 mana I can sacrifice it. It deals X damage to target player and a creature where X is the number of charge counters it had. So if it has 4, it deals 4 to a creature and 4 to the controller. This card has been very hyped in the previews. People were quite high on it, and it has an atrocious win rate. I think that around 51% win rate in best of 1. And the question was that, is it because people build decks with Dragonspark Reactor badly, or is it because the card is bad? So I looked at it, and I looked at decks that contain 0, 1, or 2 Dragonspark Reactors, and then I looked at the number of artifacts in those decks. And so obvious conclusion is that you don't want to have under 10 artifacts in a Dragonspark Reactor deck. The win rates of decks that have under 10 artifacts and a Dragonspark Reactor are atrocious. But it doesn't get very much better. I think almost in every level from 6 to 19 artifacts that I tested, the decks that have 0 Dragonspark Reactors do better than the decks that have 1. And definitely the decks that have 2 of them are performing worse than the decks that have 1 of them. So based on this data, it seems to me that the card is just bad. You shouldn't draft it. You should maybe avoid building around it, because if the 17 artifact decks with 2 of them perform poorly, Dunk CJ, I think, is saying that loving the 6% drop from 12 to 13 artifact. I mean, this is clearly an outlier. I would rather look at this whole line, and this whole line does not look impressive. So 2 Dragonspark Reactors perform very, very poorly. It has an outlier result if you have 12 artifacts, but I can't imagine that, if you have 11 or 13 artifacts, having 2 Dragonspark Reactors is bad, but if you have exactly 12, all of a sudden it starts performing. So I would look at it more holistically and then just see, like, it doesn't look very good if you have two Dragonspark reactors in your deck. The card does nothing for majority of the game and probably should be avoided. And even having one, maybe like having one in deck that has 17 plus artifacts would be fine. Fine, not great, just fine. But again, you have to keep in mind that numbers here are going to be slightly different in terms of percentage points. And also, again, ignoring this 18 number, which possibly is also an outlier, still the heavy artifact decks with 0 Dragonspark reactors slightly overperform the ones that have 1. So I think that very heavy artifact decks are better, which I think we showed in the spectrum graphs before. But very heavy artifact decks that do contain Dragonspark reactors, or even 2 of them, perform even worse than the ones that only that contain 0. So I would say card is a massive trap. It fooled many people, me included. In the previous season, I was thinking it will be okay, but it's just not. Right. Second card I wanted to talk, and the last card I wanted to talk, by the way, is Fade into Antiquity. So Fade into Antiquity, in my show that was before the release of the format, I showed that the numbers on the card look really promising because it hits quite a lot. It hits around 66% of the creatures in the format, and some really good creatures indeed. And then actually at common, the number becomes even higher. So it hits a lot of the most predominant creatures in the format. And the card has decent win rates. So I decided to check: is there a number? Oh, just coming back to the Reactor, busily is asking, why is Reactor performing better in sealed? I don't know. But maybe in sealed you just want to have more removal, and maybe in some cases stumbling on turn 2 and not playing a creature but playing this thing to accumulate counters is less punishing than skipping a 2-drop in a draft where people curve out, especially in best of 1. So I think that, yeah, again, the card is partially suffering from best of 1 being extremely unkind to people that skip playing things. So yeah, as I said, the numbers were initially good. So I wanted to look at how many should you play, and is there like a good is there a clear indication if there is such a thing as too many of them? So first thing I did, and this is also a lesson in data analysis. First thing I did is I looked at the win rate of decks by the number of copies of Fade into Antiquity in them. And if you had 0, I got 55.6% win rate. If I got 1, 57.2. If I had 2, 57.3. And then there is a drop off to 63 if you have 3 or 4 copies, but the numbers are quite small, so I'm not going to focus on that data. And I compared that and said, well, that looks pretty solid. It looks like there is a big improvement. So you want to have 1 and 2 copies are probably not detrimental. But then I thought, okay, but now I'm comparing decks with green to decks with not necessarily green. And that's not a very good thing, especially if I can very easily solve that problem. Because of course, decks without green have a slightly lower win rate because green seems to be the best color in the format. So it's an unfair comparison to compare non-green decks to green decks. And the difference is not big, as I'm going to show you very quickly. So here we have 55.6% win rate if you have 0 copies of Fade. When I corrected it and I looked at only the decks that do contain green, it becomes 56.1% win rate. Small difference, but if you analyze the data badly, one day you will find a case where the difference is actually humongous. So it's better to be attent to potential biases you're introducing to your data analysis. So Later, I just looked at the decks that contain green and have 0 copies of Fade into Antiquity, or decks that contain green and have 1 or 2 copies of them. And obviously, the 1 and 2 copy numbers didn't change because the decks that contain Fade into Antiquity have green. But we have a slightly higher win rate of the decks that don't contain it, so the advantage of putting it in is slightly smaller, from 1.5 percentage points to 1 percentage point. But um, but it still means that having 1 or even 2 copies is quite useful. Uh, Interesting part, uh, off the top of my head, it was around 36,000 games here and around 28,000 here. So almost and around 5,000 here. So it's almost half of the green decks do contain a copy of Fade into Antiquity, and they do better. So these numbers convince me that the card is really good. Um, uh, and still, we can't really exclude that maybe you get Fade into Antiquity when green was particularly open, and you don't get any when green was not particularly open. So it's not only the effect of it's not only the effect of playing the card, but it also is an effect of draft being not particularly green open and people still deciding to play green. But I can't really disentangle this kind of effect, so we'll have to live with the fact that it might be there, and we can't quantify it, so we have to live with it. But keep that in mind that it's always very hard to give a very precise answer to those questions because there are so many confounding factors in Magic. But long story short, Fade into Antiquity, good card. You can play 1 copy definitely, and most likely 2 copies are fine in best of 1. All right. So I've seen something in the question that I wanted to. Oh, yeah, Sisyphus says, will you talk about Roaring Earth? I thought this card looked great, but it's been super awkward when I've played it, and the numbers are pretty bad. I still read it and think this should be amazing. I'm not going to do any numbers of Roaring Earth. This is basically the end of the seminar, but um, I think I'm going to introduce this segment talking about 1 or 2 cards in a bit more detail at the end of the seminar in the future in every episode. And if I'm not going to forget about it, I'm going to put Roaring Earth next episode. So yeah, just come back next week and we can see what they managed to dig out. See, Roaring Earth, dig out, yeah. About Roaring Earth from the data and basically try to see if there are any cards that do particularly well. Zach Kagan is telling, I've been beaten by Roaring Earth. It might be a deck construction issue. It's the Boseiju Saga's best friend forever. And yeah, well, we can see if there is any kind of improvement when you have both Boseiju and Roaring Earth. So I'll try to dig something out on that particular topic for the next week. But not this week because I just don't have it on hand and it would take ages. Right, with that, as always, all the data that I get is from 17lands.com. So I would like to thank the 17lands team, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, and Grantwu, who are working tirelessly now to improve the win rate data to account for the ninjutsu. I feel for them. And I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown for helping me to develop this stream seminar into a podcast because he's doing quite a lot of things to make it being published as a podcast every week. And yeah, from what I heard, he might be expanding into doing it as a service to other people. He's got very big experience in journalism, radio journalism, or things like that, or streaming help, editing. So if you have any content that you might need some TLC from someone that actually knows what they're doing, unlike me, I would recommend getting in touch with Fake Jake Brown and seeing what he can do for you. Also, for those that listen to this in the form of a podcast, big thanks to Esescu and Mana Junkie for the theme song that I'm using. And with that, well, thank you for listening, and I'll be there with you next week.